we found out that really each of these vendors, they really were strong in one, but maybe not all of the three critical areas for analytics, which was a technical perspective, meaning they were very good at their tools, or statistical, meaning they understood the math very well, or industry knowledge. But no one was, including Duke, was very strong in all three. And we also found that we, perhaps with the data that we had, if we could federate more of it, we could create more value. But when we kept our siloed perspective, obviously we really limited the value we could get out of the systems. And that, I think we touched on this earlier, but culture and process and organizational change is not just as daunting, but is actually more daunting than the underlying technology itself. It's actually extremely difficult for us to move the organization, and that is our biggest challenge. Of course, we also found that unstructured data, I've heard a lot of folks say that if you just put everything in Hadoop, all your problems are solved. And we saw that using Hadoop or unstructured data was actually very helpful for finding new things and eliminating bias in our predetermined structures of a relational database. But what it wasn't good at all was, once you had that use case, to solve those problems on a recurring basis. So I tend to think of the unstructured data as good for discovery, and the relational or the structured data good for your everyday, once you've figured out what it is you want to go tackle. In terms of the technical tools, we saw that, of course, obviously the more the Internet of Things and the connectivity and communication of systems we get, we have far more data and potentially big data, and where that can become a problem or an opportunity for us to go chase. But we noticed that when we talk about big data here within utilities, it's not really a classic big data problem. Telecom companies, banks, insurance companies, they have a big data problem. Instead, what we have is a lot of what I would term small data problems of siloed data that's difficult to mix together. We also saw that really each use case, or everything we did here, really was very siloed in terms of its systems and its data. And we found that once we mixed all that stuff up, we found that we could get a lot better value out of it. And so part of our biggest challenge is, how do we break down our silos? And of course, we saw here at the very last that the majority of the big data analytics vendors, they don't really understand our business yet, but we think they are learning it very quickly as they bring on new staff and they learn the use cases and what really matters to us and what our infrastructure is like. I mentioned this previously before, that really the strength of that relational database is the schema itself, but also its biggest weakness, because that schema, not only is it inflexible and difficult to change and brittle when you have new use cases or new ideas, but it inherently implies a bias in the data, because you're saying this is the data that's the key and therefore it's the most important. And these other pieces of data really tie to that key. And that, in a sense, putting a bias into that relational database. And when you start asking these more complex questions that cross silos, then you really can't do a relational database to discover new value. And that's really where these Hadoop or NoSQL, MapReduce, these sorts of solutions are so valuable, because it really helps us do the exploration work to find out where the values may really reside. And of course, Hadoop or these sorts of tools, they really can help reduce your IT costs, because they can scale and run on very parallelized commodity type equipment. And if you use the open source solutions, you don't have to pay a licensing cost. That's really nice, but I find that even our folks don't like open source, because they really like somebody who's got a financial check on the line that they need to go to when they have a problem. And then, of course, the IT tools for ingestion and storage, they may be becoming more commoditized, but I wouldn't overlook them, especially ingestion. Obviously the old saying of garbage in, garbage out. If you ingest garbagey data, you get garbagey results. So you really need to pay attention to that and understand that you need to think of the entire ecosystem, not just, say, storage or the in-analytics widget that you're going to get, but really the entire ecosystem of how you're going to go do that as you're thinking about your strategy and how you really ought to progress forward. So with that, where Duke is right now is we're continuing to really work towards device interoperability and distributed applications. And then we're really looking to consolidate and add more use cases, standardize on our categories, and really start to implement some of these things. To really partner with vendors, as I mentioned earlier, we had a lot like Interval Analytics, SAS, certainly FICO and others, Itron, that all had some really interesting stuff that came out of it. Well, now it's time to start finding some partnership opportunities and to continue our dialogue with those vendors, to take the strategy and now start implementing some first-of-its-kind activities here at the company. And of course, our data storage area, where we're really dumping all this data and doing a lot of the interesting things on mixing up and breaking down silos, is our sandbox. and we're going out for our second round of requirements to really add even more data, this time generation and transmission data, that will add significant value to the next round of analytics work that we'll be doing. And then, of course, continue to define our company's big data strategy and architecture. We've just kicked off a process to start doing that, and this data, this work here that I was just referencing, will feed into that and really help us come up with that consolidated cross-company perspective. With that being said, I'm at the end of my slides. I'd like to turn it back over to Jesse for Q&A.
Thank you, Raiford. That was Raiford Smith of Duke Energy. I'm Jesse Berst of Smart Grid News, and you're listening to a Smart Grid News webinar on the topic of data analytics. So I think I'll start this question and ask Raiford to start and maybe Bill to chime in. But Michael wants to know, you both mentioned cultural issues. Can you suggest any tactics for overcoming that culture change obstacle?
Yeah, I think at least how we attempt to do this at Duke, that's essentially what, even though emerging technology is our title, really what we're really about is change management. And the way we do that is, we're a very small organization, but we essentially partner up with the business owners as well as the folks that support and build these systems. And what we allow them to do through this process is learn, get their hands on the new technology, and essentially see the business value by participating. That, I think, really helps everyone understand why we're attempting to do something. It helps us learn very quickly because they have buy-in into the results. And overall, I think that sort of cultural mix between the people whose job is to go look out into the future and the other folks whose job is to deploy or to operate, when we start mixing and matching those folks together on projects, it really helps create the culture that moves towards adoption of new technologies and the benefits that can come from it.
Terrific. And Bill?
Yeah, I agree with Raiford completely. And we had to bring the technology, for instance, in the control room. We had to bring the technology into the control room and let them use it and iterate it and sit with them through storms and how they handle storms. And once they saw the benefit, then they became the champions. And that's ultimately what you want, is you want an operational group to become a champion for you, and that can help it grow into other areas. Some knew what they wanted to do. Telecoms groups will move faster than others. We had far fewer barriers with telecoms than we did with other organizations, but similar to what Raiford said, we still run into cylinders of excellence, and they want us to keep things within their silo, and so you just have to keep working on them, frankly. Just have to keep working with them, improve the value, but you have to get them to buy into it and them to see it, and then they'll forward become your champion.
Larsh or Aaron, anything you've seen from working with a lot of different utilities?
I think the concept of trusting the data is really important. And I think that's where focusing on a particular problem and using data to drive that problem successfully then starts to build that trust, and I think that then is that means to sort of permeate the rest of the organization.
Thank you. Aaron, did you want to chime in as well?
I've been noticing more and more of the operations teams coming to us and asking us for direct interaction on solving some use cases, and then going with them to the IT organization, which seems to be a little bit reversed than how it used to be before.
Interesting. Thank you. We've heard several mentions about the issues with proprietary systems and linking them. Are there any relevant standards? Larsh, I'll start with you, and anyone who wants to chime in. Are any particularly useful approaches or products that help with that challenge?
Well, I think, again, we've got many different concepts here around the analytics, and I think you've seen from both Raiford and Bill that there are sort of a federation of platforms, if you will, in terms of the technology. But I do think that the common theme from both guys was that you need to have data that is got a common definition, a common semantic in the case of SIM modeling, which is an important element, and then some reasonably common frameworks for storing data, which I think is when the unstructured approaches start to have problems, when the semantics are not clear to the different use cases and the different applications. So that kind of SIM modeling, I think, is certainly one of the common advantages in processing data in a uniform way.
Great, great. Okay, so Glenn asks, and this is in some ways a little bit related, but equipment vendors need to choose some form of communications interface and protocol And he asked if you have any suggestions on choosing, DNP3, SF2, OpenADR, especially with respect to not just collecting information from the equipment, but sending commands back to it. Anyone have thoughts on that?
This is Raiford from Duke. I would say there's a couple things to consider there. First is we should probably consider the OSI model as a framework to use. There's the question of routing, which is one problem to solve in that question. So that's like a TCP versus UDP, IP, Modbus, whatever type question. And in that case, I tend to favor IP. It's usually one of the most robust solutions, and there's a lot of theory and work behind making that robust for great routing. I would say on the other side, federating systems, which is the second problem. That's really a matter of speaking or having common APIs for your particular language that your device is talking from an application to another application. And in that sense, what Duke is doing, we're trying to test out the use of an open source message bus, a field message bus, which is a common language for everything to speak. And we're using MQTT. That allows us to translate all different Modbuses and whatnot to that language and then allow anything to publish or subscribe in it. And that is an OASIS standard, certainly something that utilities can adopt today.
Terrific, thank you. So this concludes the live portion of our webcast. We'll leave this slide up so you have our contact information if you need it. And so all that really remains for me to give a very sincere thank you to our presenters. Very helpful information. Thanks for your time and for your helpful advice.
And to say thank you to you as well for joining us today. Please watch Smart Grid News for the announcement of our next Lessons from the Real World webinar, and I hope to see you back here then.